now clicking the big blue button. And
okay.
We are live. Welcome everyone to a reading with Quenby Olson. It is going to be an extra fabulous reading. Quinn has embraced fully the essence of QuaranCon, which I think is lighthearted fun. She made a challenge on Twitter and it was met with great fervor. So y'all are in for a treat. Quinn is the author of many books, but the most recent publication is Miss Percy's Pocket Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons. It is a delightful book that I enjoyed reading very much, and we hope that y'all will enjoy. Is that what you're reading from tonight? I assume.
Yes,
like,
yes,
did I go? Yeah. Okay. It'd really be extra funny if you weren't, but. So that is what she will.
I'm reading a non-fiction book about fungus, and that's what we'll be reading tonight.
With a vague British accent and a fez, or similar. Actually, I'm not sure if that qualifies as a fez or if it's just a fun, looks like a flower pot hat. So anyway, but that's it. I'm out of here. I'm gonna turn off my camera. Y'all won't see me. I will relay questions as they come up in the chat. After the reading portion. So I leave it in Quinn's capable hands. Everyone, please enjoy Quenby Olson and her fabulous fake British accent.
Okay. It is over to me now. Okay. I've never done a reading before, so you will have to bear with me. So I am reading from Miss Percy's Pocket Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons, which is a book that I wrote 2 years ago. I started writing it at the beginning of the pandemic. We were in lockdown and I needed something to occupy me, and this story poured out of me quite quickly. It is a cozy fantasy, low stakes, which means there's no huge epic battles. There's no people dying left and right. There's no great epic prophecies. It is about Miss Mildred Percy, who is a spinster. She's in her 40s. She has dedicated her life to her family. She took care of her parents when they were sick. She then moved in with her sister and took care of their family, and has never really lived for herself. She has only done for others. And then her uncle, her great uncle, leaves her a trunk full of curiosities. He was a historian, amateur archaeologist, and leaves her all sorts of interesting little artifacts. And one of the things that he leaves her is a dragon egg. The thing about this story is that it's not set in a fantasy world where there are people riding around on broomsticks or doing magic, and there's not already dragons everywhere that anyone knows about. This is a story like something that Jane Austen would write, or Elizabeth Gaskell. Very normal life. Let's have tea. Let's go to church on Sundays. Let's do these things. And then she gets a dragon egg in this trunk of curiosities, and she takes it to the local vicar, Mr. Wigan, who helps her to go through all different things in the trunk and go through her great uncle's notes. He has a housekeeper, Mrs. Babington, who goes around making sure everyone is fed and taken care of. And after a few chapters, they discover that this rock, they thought it was a rock, a geode that you would open up and find crystals, it's actually a dragon egg, and it hatches out of it. That is the scene that I will be reading tonight. Is the scene where the dragon egg hatches and suddenly goes from being just a humdrum British manners, let's have tea, to, oh crap, there's a dragon. So the one thing I do have to say, I'm wearing a hat because of a Twitter challenge that got quite out of hand very quickly. And I will also be attempting, dear Lord help me, to read this in my sad, I'm sorry, I apologize to the entire English speaking world, British accent. Lord help me, Lord help me. So yes, the scene that I'm reading is going to be, we're starting partway into chapter 5, so I'm jumping in a little bit, mostly for time constraints. So this will be when Mildred She goes to the vicarage in the morning because Mr. Wiggin has sent a note saying, you have to come to the vicarage right now. There's an emergency. She has no idea what's going on. She gets there and finds that the dragon egg, which Naomi thought was a rock up until this point, is about to hatch. So I'm going to start here and let's say a little prayer. Okay. She arrived at the vicarage without trading more than a nod and greeting with any of the other townspeople. If anyone followed her progress towards Mr. Wiggins' home or wondered why she was calling at such an early hour, she paid no heed as she rang the bell and bounced on the balls of her feet until Mrs. Babington opened the door. Oh, goodness, you're here. Mrs. Babington nearly grabbed at her arm and hauled her inside like a piece of baggage. He's been in a state all night, refused to tell me what is happening, and could hardly wait until daylight to see a note sent off to you. Mildred didn't even have time to remove her bonnet or gloves before she was being unceremoniously steered towards not the study this time, but rather the sitting room at the front of the house. Why is it so warm in here, was what she tried to say as Mr. Wiggin leapt to his feet from his place in front of the fire, as Mrs. Babington backed out of the room before Mr. Wiggin could rush over and slam the door in her face, and as Mildred blinked at the darkness of the room she'd just been pushed into. Mr. Wiggin turned around, his back pressed against the now firmly shut door. On the other side of it came an audible huff of frustration before the quick retreat of Mrs. Babington's footsteps marked her departure for the sanctuary of the kitchen. What? Mildred tried again, but Mr. Wiggin raised one finger to his lips. Miss Percy, he said, his voice a rough whisper, and then he paused, the fingers of the hand in front of his mouth unfurling as he held it towards her, imploring her with that movement to remain where she was. Something extraordinary has occurred. She studied his face. He did not look well. There were shadows beneath his eyes that were rimmed with red and decorated with an assortment of tiny veins creeping their way across the whites. Are you? She glanced around the room, searching specifically for any bottles or decanters or flasks that would denote a night spent imbibing too many spirits, and not of a variety associated with the Holy Trinity. Have you slept at all? She amended, when there was nothing obvious to be found. No, of course not, he replied, flicking her query away with a wave of his hand. He then smoothed his fingers over his head, an action that only served to show how many times he must have repeated the movement over the last several hours. Though Mr. Wiggin was not in possession of much hair worth boasting about, the tonsure he did have was alternately sticking out from his head or lying flat, as if greased in place, without any pretension towards neatness or style. Come here, he said finally, and grasping her gloved hands, pulled her further into the room and towards the fire. The fire, Mildred noted, had been built up to a raging blaze. With the drapes drawn tight, it gave the room the feel of a cocoon. Already there was perspiration gathering beneath her arms and along her upper lip, enough that she tugged one of her hands free from Mr. Wiggin's grip and fought with the tie of her bonnet beneath her chin, before her entire scalp turned into an itchy, sweating mess beneath the straw. What? She said, fully aware that she hadn't managed more than one complete sentence since arriving at the vicarage. But this time, instead of someone else interrupting her, it was the sight that met her as she neared the fireplace that halted her speech. There was a nest on the floor, in front of the fire. Well, not a nest as one would expect to find in a tree, constructed of leaves and twigs, daubed together with mud or other pieces of refuse birds tended to pluck from all over the place. This nest sat against the bricks at the edge of the hearth, the light from the flames flashing across its uneven surface. Look, he instructed. She looked. In the center of the nest was a rock. Well, not a rock, but rather the rock. The rock from her great-uncle Forthcliff's trunk, the gorgeously large rock that Matthew had argued he had witnessed roll and wobble on Mr. Wiggin's desk. And now a crack ran down one side of the rock, the simple stone they had assumed, or surely they would be able to laugh about that at some point in the future, was nothing more than a geode, a geological specimen with which to teach the village children about the formation of various minerals and crystals over time. One segment appeared to have already broken away, leaving a small hole in its upper half. Is it? An egg, he finished for her, his voice still low, for her ears alone, though egg was the last word she would have come up with on her own. It began twitching last night while I worked at my desk. Sunday's sermon, you know, I always put it off for too long. He swept the back of his hand across his brow. At any rate, it moved, not a small vibration from my jostling the thing. He licked his lips. There was something inside it. There is something inside it. If you listen closely, you might hear it, a kind of scratching, chirruping sound. Mildred finished removing her bonnet. Then she pulled off her gloves, tugging at one finger at a time, and her spencer, she tackled that as well, her hands turning into thick, stupid sausages that seemed to have forgotten how things like buttons generally worked. But it gave her a minute to think, while she tended to the normalcy of removing her outer garments and pretending as if this was a charming social call and Mrs. Babington would barge in at any moment with her overladen tray of tea and other comestibles. It's rather large for an egg. Without heeding ceremony, he dropped down to his knees and gestured for her to join him on the floor. There are some birds, not native to England, of course. He shook his head. But I do not believe... Again he paused, long enough to draw a breath that seemed weighted with something Mildred could not identify, a gravity of sorts, a kind of weight being affixed to his next words. I do not believe this is a bird. She went down onto her knees beside him. On closer inspection, she could clearly see the break in the surface of the egg shell. A few pieces of that outer layer lay amid the folds of the twisted-up blankets, and she picked up one of them, surprised at the thickness of it, the weight of that tiny sliver between her fingers. Miss Percy! Mr. Wiggins suddenly cried out, and the both of them put their heads together as the egg jolted in the middle of its wrappings, the dark shadow of some creature shifting within. I think I see an eye? Mildred wanted to open the curtains, wanted the additional light of a lamp or even a candle to better illuminate what was happening in front of them. It doesn't look like a bird, she said, her own voice dropping to the level of the vicar's rough whispers. The egg rocked lightly from side to side, while the head of the animal inside jerked and beat away at the shell with a determined vehemence that made her lean back an inch. Perhaps it is a... And then the egg burst apart, spattering them with flecks of shell and some wet, sticky substance. Mr. Wiggin might have sworn Mildred did, the oaths tumbling out before she could recall to herself any kind of preventative measures against barking curses in front of the local vicar. As a rule, Mildred rarely swore. She was aware that her knowledge of improper words was limited, that there likely existed a vast panoply of curious and colourful language she most likely would never live to hear or speak. But what words she did know she tended to keep to herself, or to the walls of her bedroom whenever she happened to strike her head on the ceiling, or mutter a few chosen phrases in imaginary conversations with Diana. Damn, she said. One look at the creature spilled across the blankets, and she said it again. Damn! Mr. Wiggins' mouth moved, but without anything audible coming out of it. It's not a bird, Mildred breathed. She knew that she breathed because she had to take the trouble of reminding herself to do so. It's some kind of bat? The vicar extended one hand towards the not-bird/bat as it writhed round on the damp, shell-laden blankets. And throughout all of that writhing, the thing, well, Mildred couldn't think of any better way to describe the noise it made than as a screech. Not a chirp or a peep or any other sound one would expect from a winged animal, but a cry that dug into her ears like metal scraped across a slate. And yes, there were wings, muddy brown stretches of nearly translucent skin that shuddered and crinkled in on themselves as the pitiful thing struggled to right itself. Bats don't hatch from eggs, Mildred said, her eyes still on the not-bird/not-bat. If anything, it most resembled a lizard, but with larger feet and strange bumps running across the top of its narrow pointed head. Well, I know that. Mr. Wiggins sounded exasperated and eager. He still had not touched the creature, the fingers of his left hand poised only a few inches away from the animal's nose. I wonder if he will let me... The creature twisted its neck around and snapped at Mr. Wiggins' finger, one wing stretching taut as if the thing wanted to leap up from its makeshift nest and fly at the man's head. Mildred bit back a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh or the first syllable of another swear. No, I do not believe he will let you, she finally managed with a quaver in her voice. Mr. Wiggins sat back on his heels, taking the time to inspect his uninjured finger, while the hatchling, Mildred paused at that and realized she preferred that word for it above all others she'd considered thus far, screeched and snorted and flailed like a staggering drunk every time it attempted to climb onto its feet. 4 feet, she noticed, 4 clawed feet, not including the wings, so not like a bird, it seemed, nor like a bat, more like a cranky, hairless kitten with wings. Oh, it's probably hungry, poor thing. She looked around the room from where she sat, still down on the floor, her skirt twisted and tucked around her legs. Goodness, what do you think it eats? Fingers, I would wager. Mr. Wiggin glared at the hatchling as if the thing were salivating at the thought of fitting its tiny jaws around one of his knuckles. Most birds feed on insects and worms. Larger birds will make a feast of a mouse or other such animal, but this one is still so small. His use of the word small seemed to be open for further discussion. It was difficult to gain an accurate measure of size from merely observing the hatchling in all of its damp, shrieking, wobbling glory, but even a cursory estimation of its length from nose to stubby tail placed it in the range of large as a dinner plate. I'll fetch Mrs. Babington, Mildred said, and wrestled with the hem of her skirt until her legs were unencumbered enough to allow her to stand without immediately tripping over herself again. Wait, no! Mr. Wiggins struggled to his own feet, his attention snapping back and forth between Mildred's progress towards the door and the hatchling behind him. He compromised by holding himself in a low crouch, one hand within arm's reach of the squalling creature, his other held out to Mildred, his palm held upwards in a gesture no doubt meant to halt her progress. She cannot know. His appearance served as a tableau depiction of burgeoning madness. The mess of his hair, the exhausted wildness of his eyes, and then the sheen of perspiration across his face and staining the parts of his shirt that were still visible beneath the coat he had not thought to remove under the onslaught of the room's unbearable warmth, and his hands trembled, an extension of the pent-up energy that vibrated through his figure. Mildred turned up her own hands, her shoulders lifting in a shrug. Why not? He hesitated. For several seconds his eyes darted around, his gaze settling on nothing, while his mouth worked over words that would not pass the barrier of his lips. I don't know. Oh, but surely she can help. She placed one hand on the doorknob. Mr. Wiggin lurched forward, stopping himself from physically hindering her movement, though his hands twitched as if with some reined-in urge to grab at her arm. It's a secret. Those 3 words, pushed out on a rush of breath without sound. Mildred swallowed. It's a secret? She repeated, careful to give her version that upwards climb on the last word. Whatever for? Mr. Wiggin turned around himself, the span of his arms taking in the hatchling, the mess of its shell, the curtains, the fire, the entirety of the universe with that sweep of his upper body. Miss Percy, he said, his voice returning to normal volume after all of his raspy whispers, surely you see the gravity of this situation. We've just witnessed the birth of a... He pointed at the creature, whose screeches were climbing to a feverish pitch. It has wings. It is a dark thing with wings and a tail. It took a moment for his implications to dawn on her. When they did, she wasn't sure if she was in need of a lap or if he was in need of a slap. Are you labouring under the belief that you've just hatched out a demon on your drawing-room floor? There were a fair number of things Mildred had gone through her life assuming she would never have to say. Not until that moment did she realize that this one had failed to make the list because of its obvious aspirations to result in preposterousness. No, His words were cut off by a choking catch in his throat. A sob? Mildred would not have thought worse of him if it was. I know it's not a demon, he continued, his hands going to his temples in a way that made her wonder if he was attempting to keep his head firmly attached to the rest of his body. Of course it's not. Demons don't exist. His gaze shot at her, his eyes widening in horror. I mean, they do. I'm a vicar. I know they do. I doubt they hatch from eggs. They're on the floor of my house in Wiltshire. There were times when Mildred very much felt the weight of having been born the eldest sibling in her family, the one who had remained behind with her father and taken care of him as age and illness had overwhelmed him, the one left to shoulder so many of those unseen responsibilities that made up the foundation of a household, everything else resting on those sprawling, stable roots. Releasing the doorknob, she took Mr. Wiggin's arm and led him, he moved with an almost feeble gait, as if he had aged several decades overnight, to one of the armchairs set at a remove from the fireplace in the worst of its heat. Where do you keep your spirits? She asked herself, as she left him long enough to search the shelves and 1 or 2 cabinets for a small collection of crystal bottles. Most of them bore a fine layer of dust, including the accompanying glasses. She snatched up one of the glasses, wiped it off on her skirt, and filled it halfway with brandy. Take this, she told him, and pressed the drink into his hand. He behaved as if he would protest, but he finally accepted the drink and downed half of it in the first swallow. With Mr. Wiggin seated and out of the way, she again went to the door, opened it, and called for Mrs. Babington. The good lady must have known an eventual summons was inevitable, as she popped out from the direction of the kitchen with the asperity of a freshly oiled jack-in-the-box. I need your help, Mildred said as the housekeeper approached. No doubt it was best to prostrate herself at Mrs. Babington's feet if she wanted everything to be seen to as it should. It's Mr. Wiggin, isn't it? Mrs. Babington buried her hands in her apron, then smoothed the fabric down again. Is it an attack of some sort? I never thought he would be the kind to succumb to weak nerves, but Mildred pushed open the door, giving the housekeeper a full view of the sitting room and all of its inhabitants. Mr. Wiggin is as well as can be expected, she said, as Mrs. Babington stepped past her and into the room. But it seems we have an unexpected arrival this morning. Heavens! Mrs. Babington stopped halfway across the room, both of her work-raw hands flying to her chest. It looks like a broiled pheasant. Mr. Wiggin drained the last of his brandy and rested the empty glass on his knee. It must be an exotic species, he said, and Mildred was glad to see some of the wildness had already faded from his eyes. Can't think where your great-uncle must have found it. It needs to eat, I imagine, Mildred said, drawing Mrs. Babington's attention again. It's newly born, and it's hungry. Can you fetch a few things it might like to eat? Came the housekeeper's steady and not at all baffled reply. Any kind of soft-boiled meat you might have. I do not know if it has any teeth. A snort from Mr. Wiggin, who was still slowly twirling his glass on his knee. But if you could arrange a selection of things to see what it might prefer? Mrs. Babington's hands drifted away from the vicinity of her chest as her shoulders pushed back, a measure of steel reinvigorating her spine now that she'd been given a task to complete. Yes, I'll see what I have set aside. Maybe some fruit. Do you think it would like a few berries or an apple? Birds like berries, Mr. Wiggin announced, looking at no one in particular, and some bats eat fruit. It's not a bat, Mildred reminded him, her words balanced on a fraying thread of patience. Unfortunately, we don't know what it is, she said to Mrs. Babington, so until we do, I'm afraid there's going to be quite a bit of trial and error ahead of us. Mildred thought she heard another snort from the vicar, but when she glanced towards where he sat, it was to see that he had slumped down into his chair, his head lolling against his shoulder as he snored himself into a deeper slumber. I'll return in a few minutes with some food for the housekeeper's gaze flicked to the hatchling, now half tangled in a sheet and furiously gnawing at the end of its own tail. Well, just give me a few minutes. Oh, and don't worry about him, she added as she headed towards the door, nudging her elbow in the direction of Mr. Wiggins' unconscious form. Just toss a blanket over him and he'll be fine till it's time for tea. And scene. Okay.
Woohoo! That was awesome. What? That was so good. Everyone in the chat on YouTube is exploding over how good your RP was. That was amazing. Also, there were many comments of the hat. See, more hats. I told you all. They will, when they see this, they will also exclaim in excitement. Question: do you prefer me as a disembodied voice, or do you want my face? What is more comforting to you? I'm happy to just read questions to you from the chat without actually showing my face. Okay. Or yeah. So there was a legit question. Well, I did variably legit, and that is from Ryan. Ryan says, wait, where did it go? Come back. Okay. He says, be honest. How many times did you practice this accent? And then he says 14. It was 14, wasn't it? So
I'm trying to scroll through the comments here to see.
There's a lot going on.
I know. There's a lot. I thought they were holy crap.
There's a lot of love. There's a lot of appreciation of the accent. There's a lot of what is it? Yes.
It fits over the headphones.
Love of hats. There you go. Nice. Now you've got headphones and hat. Yeah. That was great.
Thank you.
And that's a fun scene too. Excellent choice.
I wanted to do that scene because that was actually the first scene that I had in notes in my head. That was kind of the scene that gave birth to the story. So for me, for my brain, that was the introduction to the story.
Totally.
Is that scene.
Right.
So when I started writing it, that was the first goal, was get to this scene where the dragon hatches and all of that and the craziness ensues.
Amazing. That had to be a fun point to be working towards as well, to be like, yes, now I get to write the scene.
You know.
Very cool. Did you write that scene first, or was it just that was in your notes and then you started the beginning?
No, it was just notes and I think a couple lines of dialogue, like not even enough to fill a page. Wow, that was all I had.
Gotcha. But that was the driving force as you started the draft.
Yeah, that was the first goal. Yes.
Awesome. Well, that is fabulous. And I could I would find that very inspiring. Like to be headed towards that scene would be incredibly entertaining.
Yeah.
I'm just still cackling at the comments. We've got, Crystal O'Connor and everybody just shouting.
Yeah, this is a lot. This was a very busy audience, and I'm very glad I did not have it open. I closed it off because I was like, I can't do this. It will distract me.
Yeah, no, that is reasonable. Very reasonable, especially while you're reading. So everybody who's sitting there watching, now's the time to pop all your awesome questions in. We addressed, I read Ryan's question aloud, but Quinn actually hasn't answered it yet. So I'll repeat it. Ryan's question was, how many times did you practice that accent? And was it or was it not 14?
I practiced that. Well, okay, here's the thing. And this is something that you guys have to know is that while writing this book, anytime I had to read the scenes out loud, especially dialogue scenes and any of the parentheticals, I read them out loud in a British accent because I thought that would make it sound more like it should, Regency England. So that was what I did. So I'd be sitting around the house at 5 o'clock in the morning while my kids were asleep, and I'd be in front of the computer going, la, 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 you know, out loud, hoping that like my husband wouldn't use the bathroom and be like, what is going on downstairs? You know? So
honestly, that just sounds like a good time.
You know, so I mean, I wasn't practicing it to be heard by anyone. I was just doing it to get that kind of cadence, you know, what you think of that kind of Judi Dench cadence. You know? So that was what I was going for.
You succeeded admirably. Well played. We've actually only got 4 minutes left, so I'm hoping if people maybe have like thrown more questions in here, or is there anything else you'd like to talk about in the book? I love that you got yet another hat. Is there anything you want to say about this? You got 4 minutes to just say anything you want about this book and what you want people to know about it.
Geez. I will say that I'm very pleased to have written a book that was about someone who's in her 40s and having an adventure. That was something I really wanted to do. I'm glad that seems to be connecting with a lot of people. I know. Oh, I see a question.
Are multiple dragons in the cards for the series?
You know what? I mean, it could be a spoiler, but you know what? I'm just going to answer it and say yes. Yes.
Yes.
So yes, there are more. There are more, multiple, plural, more.
Much applause.
Kind of, yes. So this is the beginning. This kind of starts out a whole new world. So this changes it from being the Cranford story where there's no fantasy to suddenly by the end of the series there's fantasy. I will spoil it and say that the second book we have some magic that comes in. And we also have a witch. So so the world expands tremendously as they go along on their adventures.
That's very exciting to hear. I actually already knew that because of a conversation you and I had about it, and I'm very excited. Yes. Very, very excited because that is awesome. I'm seeing people are like fist pump, yay!
Dragons,
more dragons, more magic.
Okay.
Yes, woohoo! Last one for the last 2 minutes. We've got an amazing witch hat. Absolutely epic.
Yeah, so you can see.
I am not seeing any more new questions show up, but yeah, I'm excited. Approximately how many books are going to be in the series? Do you have an idea?
Yes. We have the second book is Miss Percy's Travel Guide to Welsh Morals and Feral Dragons.
Oh my God, I think the title makes me so happy.
The third one is Miss Percy's Definitive Guide to London Magic and the Return of the Dragons.
What? Okay, I'm so excited because of both of those titles. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the third one's a bit of a spoiler because we've got dragons in plural and London, so we kind of get an idea of what's happening.
Right. Yes. But I think, the best kind of spoiler is the one that just makes you want to read the book more, and that certainly qualifies. I think I'm not seeing, like I said, any more questions, but that was an amazing reading. I hope that everyone has come away from this with an appreciation of your ability to read in a fake British accent and wear silly hats, and also how freaking awesome that book is. So everyone go buy a copy. We have now reached the end of our time. We got to get out of here. There's another event starting right now. So everyone, please go check out that reading that's happening right away. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Quinn, for doing this reading.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
So delightful. All right, bye, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
That went so much faster than I expected.